had someone to tell them. So the blind man came in, and the person sitting reciting Quran, you would interrupt them to ask them, Afwan, which way is the Qibla? And you just wait till they reach the end of the verse and tell you. Right? So the adab of interruption is what? If someone, for example, is reciting, what do? You go and sit in a way where they notice that you're sitting facing them, for example, as a befitting the seating. Right? So that, once they finished the section, whatever, they tell you. Right? And maybe initially, if they don't, then maybe you turn towards them. If they don't, then, you'd say, softly, you say afwan, for example, right? To give them, without interrupting them, you indicate that you need them. So you allow them to reach, to finish where they're at. If they don't stop, then you would take more means than that, right? Because interruption, al-mashghul la yushghal, right? The busy person is not busied. That's why there's a lot of adab to be found in the books of the rulings of salam. Right? And a lot of etiquette is understood from them. That's why the ulama have written entire work, some of them well over 100 pages, on the adab of salam and the meanings of salam, etc. Okay. Because But if there was someone there, then the blind man's prayer would not be valid, because he did not take the means that were at his disposal. Because you're obligated to ask somebody. You don't have to go knock on people's doors, but if someone was there, you didn't ask them which way the Qibla was, and the blind man was aware of the presence of that person. Okay. But the man who came in upon the blind person praying towards other than the Qibla, he couldn't pray behind the blind man in this case, because in the first situation, right? لقدرته في الأولى وعلم خطئه في الثانية. The second one's obvious because you know that they were facing other than the Qibla. And in the first, because the blind man's prayer, when he was facing other than the Qibla, was weak, was da'if. Right? The blind man there is considered ajiz. They're unable. And the person who, the blind man was facing away from the Qibla, this person helped him face the Qibla and then wanted to join in. When the blind man began the prayer, they were ajiz. They're unable. So their prayer was valid with respect to themselves, but that's a weak state at that point. At that point, when the blind man began the prayer, the man who was going to pray behind them, he was able. Right? So his state is stronger. وَلَا يُبْنَى الْقَوِيُّ عَلَى الضَّعِيفِ here, right? And this is explained out. And there's some discussion on this issue as well. Okay. وَلَا إِعَادَةَ عَلَيْهِ أي على المتحري لو علم بعد فراغه أنه أخطأ الجهة. Right? So let's read the matan first. ولا إعادة عليه لو أخطأ وإن علم بخطئه في صلاته استدار وبنى. Right? And if one does not have to repeat the prayer if one erred, and if one came to know of one's error within the prayer, one turns and builds upon one's prayer. Turns towards the right direction. وإن شرع بلا تحرٍ. So in this situation, of course, one case is you know the Qibla, it's straightforward. Right? You face the Qibla. But if you don't know the Qibla, you make taharri. Right? Now, what if you made a mistake? Right? We made a mistake. Right? So you could break this down in multiple ways. One is that there's three cases, right? There's al-ilmu bil-qibla, al-taharri, and al-jahl bil-qibla. If you know the qibla, we're assuming sanity, what would you do? You face the qibla. So that's a done deal. But just to conceptually break down, you either know the qibla, you have ilm, or you exercise your judgment, that's taharri, or you pray without taharri. That's the third case. Right? So let's leave the knowing the qibla aside. If you made taharri, if you exercise your judgment, at the end of it, your prayer is valid whether you are correct or not. Right? If you exercise your judgment, there's two possibilities, right? You face the qibla or you didn't. Right? So in this case, if you use your prayer is valid whether you found out within the prayer that you were not, whether you prayed to the right direction or you discovered within the prayer that you're not facing the direction. What do? You face the right direction. So you thought the qibla was this way because you came into seekers, you saw a mihrab. Just show them the mihrab. Right? Right? You saw the mihrab, so you'd think that that's the qibla. But which way is the qibla? The qibla is the other direction. You may not be able to get there. Are you able to swivel them? Yeah. The qibla is actually in that direction. Yeah, they can see it. Right? Come back. Right? So, if you use your judgment to face the qibla, when you didn't know which way the qibla was, then your prayer is going to be valid. If you found, because if you make taharri, there's two possibilities. You are correct or you're incorrect. If you're correct, it's a done deal. If you're incorrect, you could find out within the prayer or after the prayer. So you could diagram this, and I'm leaving it for you to diagram. Right? So you know the qibla, you use your judgment, or you didn't use your judgment. When you use your judgment, two possibilities: you are correct, then khalas, your prayer is valid. If you were incorrect, then when you're incorrect, there's two possibilities. You discovered that you're incorrect within the prayer, so what do? You face the qibla. If you discovered you're incorrect after the prayer, what do you have to do? Nothing. So use your judgment. Try to face the qibla. Turns out you faced the wrong way. You don't have to. You're not called upon to repeat the prayer because you weren't. إذا تعذر اليقين يصار إلى الظن. When certainty is not possible, you exercise reasoned judgment. Right? And you did what you're commanded to do. Okay, that's if you used your judgment. If you didn't use your judgment, you came in and he said, I don't know which way the qibla is, I don't care, I'm going to pray this way. That act, firstly, is sinful. Why? Because you are commanded to take the means to face the qibla. And in this situation, there are four possibilities. Right? And if you diagram it, you can retain it. In this situation, there are four possibilities. This is the situation where you didn't exercise judgment. You just began the prayer, you didn't know the qibla, you didn't exercise judgment. Case 3. Here, you either faced the qibla, you didn't use your judgment. You ended up, there's two possibilities, right? You did face the qibla or you didn't. Right? So there are actually four, you did face the qibla or you didn't. And in both cases, you could discover that you're facing the qibla or not facing the qibla within the prayer or after. In all these cases, there's four cases, there's only one situation where your prayer would be valid, which is that you discover after the prayer that you were in fact facing the Qibla. Because if you discover within the prayer, your state within the prayer goes from a weak state to a stronger state. وَلَا يُبْنَى الْقَوِيَّ عَلَى الضَّعِيفِ. If you discover after the prayer that you had in fact faced the Qibla, that's the one scenario in which the prayer is valid, but you committed a sin of praying without trying to face the Qibla, because is the basis that you're facing the Qibla or not? No. There's 75% chance that you're not facing the Qibla, right? Because there's 4 directions. At any one given, at any one time, there's only 1/4 chance that you're in the direction of the Qibla. So that's the summary of the issue. You can diagram it, right? وَلَا إِعَادَةَ عَلَيْهِ لَوْ أَخْطَأَ. So he says, لَا إِعَادَةَ عَلَيْهِ, there's no repetition upon them, أي المتحري, upon the one who prayed not knowing the Qibla, but they exercised their judgment, تحري. لَوْ عَلِمَ بَعْدَ فَرَاغِهِ أَنَّهُ أَخْطَأَ, if they found out after the prayer that they had erred, they were facing away from the direction. لقول سيدنا عامر بن عقبة رضي الله تعالى عنه كنا مع رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم في ليلة مظلمة فلم ندري أين القبلة فصلى كل رجل منا على حياله فلما أصبحنا ذكرنا ذلك لرسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم فنزلت فأينما تولوا فثم وجه الله. The hadith is in Tirmidhi and elsewhere. So Sayyidina Amir ibn Uqba relates, and what's in here, what's in Imdad al-Fattah is Amir ibn Rabi'a. So someone can actually look up the specific hadith in Tirmidhi. Very lazy, right? Because you're referencing the hadith in the footnote, right? And that's not, you don't need to worry about that at this level as a student of knowledge, but it's something to look up. But you see, like Tahtawi, so I'm reading from an edition of Tahtawi. Tahtawi himself say that what's mentioned in the Sharh is Ibn Rabi'a, Amir ibn Rabi'a, right? And you allegedly looked up the hadith in a Tirmidhi. Hadith are narrated by the companion who narrated them, and you don't check which one it is. Anybody of our compadres checked? Just check this. Okay. So he relates that we were with the Messenger of Allah ﷺ on a dark night, an intensely dark night, on a journey, meaning, and none of us knew which way the Qibla was. So each of us prayed on their own, right? In their own direction, right? Because they didn't know which way, right? And in the morning, this could well have been for their night worship, right? We mentioned that to the Messenger of Allah ﷺ, and the verses were revealed from Surah Al-Baqarah. So whichever way you turn, there is the countenance of Allah, meaning His pleasure. What?
He says the correct one is Ibn Rabi'a.
Ibn Rabi'a. Did he say he looked in Tirmidhi or just? I wouldn't. I would just check it. And it literally takes 2 seconds to check, right? Okay. Okay. وليس التحري للقبلة مثل التحري للتوضؤ والساتر. And exercising one's judgment with respect to the Qibla is not like exercising one's judgment for wudu or for something to cover one's awrah with. فإنه إذا ظهر نجاسة الماء أو الثوب أعاد, because if the filth of the water or the garment becomes clear afterwards, you repeat the prayer. لأنه أمر لا يحتمل الانتقال. Because one, it's a tangible matter. Najasa is an actual matter, it's a tangible matter. لا يحتمل الانتقال. Right? It is not susceptible to change. والقبلة تحتمله. And قبلة could change. كما تحولت عن عن المقدس إلى الكعبة. Such that when it changed from Jerusalem to the Kaaba. Right? And sometimes they call Bayt al-Maqdis al-Maqdis. Right? So they say على تقدير مضاف, but it's from the Arabic usage. So when they say al-Maqdis, they mean Bayt al-Maqdis. And that's why, that's, for example, and often the nisba to Bayt al-Maqdis is al-Maqdisi, right? From the Bay. Anyways. And also because it's more rare not to be able to tell the filth, right? Than not to be able to tell the qibla, right? Especially for travelers and so on, right? وإن علم بخطئه أو تبدل اجتهاده في صلاته استدار. If one found out that one was facing the wrong way, or one's judgment changed within the prayer, one turns. من جهة اليمين لا اليسار. And it's superior to turn from the right rather than the left. And this is critiqued by al-Tahtawi. Right? This is recommended if it's closer to the right side, or it would be equitable. Right? Because if you discover the qibla slightly to the left, doesn't mean you do a 270-degree turn. كما لا يخفى. يعني? Right? So you can look at what Tahtawi says there. So this is when either it's closer to the right side or it's the same. You've discovered the qibla is the opposite way, it'll be recommended to turn from the right. Right? وَبَنَى. And one continues the prayer. عَلَى مَا أَدَّاهُ بِالتَّحَرِّي. One builds on what one did with exercising one judgment. لأن تبدل الاجتهاد كالنسخ. Because the changing of ijtihad abrogates what came before. And the textual basis for this is وَهْلُ قَبَاء استداروا في الصلاة إلى الكعبة حين بلغهم النسخ. And the people of Qaba, when they found out that the ruling of abrogating prayer, ruling of the Qibla had changed from Jerusalem to Mecca, they turned within the prayer. That's what's called Masjid al-Qiblatayn, the Masjid of the two Qiblas. وَاسْتَحْسَنَهُ النَّبِي. And the Prophet ﷺ praised it. وَإِن تَذَكَّرَ سَجْدَةً صُلْبِيَّةً بَطَلَتْ صَلَاتُهُ. And if one remembered a sajda of the sajdas within the prayer that had been omitted, one's prayer breaks. And so this is where, in the case where you prayed to one direction, one rak'ah, and you only prostrated once. And then you changed, and your ijtihad changed, and you realized you'd only prostrated once in that way. He says that because that rak'ah is now not fixable. Right? Basically, right? Now, if your judgment changes, you also have to keep in mind here that one of the governing principles of fiqh is what? Al-ijtihadu la yunqad, with a dad, bimithlihi. Right? One judgment is not broken by another. Right? So for example, this has a lot of legal implications in mu'amalat, but has legal implications. So for example, if you use your judgment that this shirt is tahir, right? and you start praying, and you say, I think it's najis. The second judgment has no consequence. Why? Because you already made one judgment, and the second has no tarjih on the first. Right? And this is one of the doorways of waswasa. Once you exercise one judgment, you don't go back against it unless there is yaqeen, certitude. Right? You prayed, someone asked me recently about socks. They had a pair of woolen socks, but now they're having suspicion. They're thinking that maybe it wasn't sound. You acted upon it soundly, not based on unsound knowledge, right? Like you took a wrong fatwa or whatever. You wiped over them all winter on the basis that they fulfill the conditions. Now you're thinking, I'm not sure anymore. You ignore that. الاجتهاد لا ينقض بمثله. And this would apply to Qibla. If you have unless there's preponderating of it, you think the Qibla is this way, they say, I think it's that way. The basis is don't do that, right? Because of this principle. And there's details related to that. Okay. Now this relates to if there's taharri. If you use your judgment, your prayer is valid, whether you did face the Qibla or didn't, right? And we looked at the different possibilities. Then وإن شرع من اشتبهت عليه القبلة بلا تحر. If one begins the prayer when one didn't know the Qibla without exercising one judgment, this would be sinful, of course. كان فعله موقوفا. This action would be suspended in validity. فلو أتمها فعلم بعد فراغه من الصلاة أنه أصاب أي القبلة صحت. If one found out after finishing the prayer that you had faced the actual Qibla, your prayer is valid. لأنه تبين الصواب لأنه بتبين الصواب بطل الحكم بالاستصحاب وثبت الجواز من الصلاة. This is a bit of an awkward expression. الطحطاوي typically, right? 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 Because the basis, what's the basis? That once one found out that you face the right way, then the judgment, the istishab al-hal, the principle of continuity, the judgment of the principle of continuity would be lifted. And the validity will be affirmed because you did face the Qibla. What is the principle of continuity? The principle that you don't know which way the Qibla is. And the asl is that you're not facing the Qibla. Right? That's the hukm bil istishab, istishab al-hal. Istishab al-hal is the principle of continuity. Al-aslu baqa'u ma kan ala ma alayhi kan. The basis is, right? Al-aslu baqa' ma kan على ما عليه كان. And some reduce it down to al-asl al-baqa', but that's very terse. And these qawa'id fiqhiyya have many different ways they're expressed, and it's something that is good to read upon. You can find this al-asl baqa' ma kan على ما عليه كان from the qawa'id of the Majalla and the Ashbah and other works. Al-Khadimi, of course, has a series of qawa'id. Do you know about that, Effendi? Al-Khadimi has a work in Usul al-Fiqh called Majami' al-Haqa'iq. At the end, he has a section on the Qawa'id. And Al-Khadimi's Majami' al-Haqa'iq has been published recently in multiple editions, but very disappointingly, they didn't actually publish the commentary on it, called Manafi' al-Daqa'iq. Subhanallah. وإن علم بإصابته فيها ولو بغالب الظن فسدت لأن حالته قويت به فلا يبني هو قويا على ضعيف خلافا لأبي يوسف رحمه الله. But if one came to know, so if one prayed without exercising judgment, and one came to know within the prayer that you are actually facing the right direction, even if by reasonable surety, not just by dhann ba'da dhann, not just by one inclination after another, but by reasonable surety, then the prayer is invalidated. Why? Because your state became strong. Praying without checking which direction is a weak state, 75% chance of invalidity. It's a weak state. And the principle is that the strong is not built on the weak, right? Contrary to Abu Yusuf, meaning in this particular case. Abu Yusuf said that even if you found out during the prayer that that you're praying the right direction, the prayer will be valid. That opinion is useful to know لإسقاط القضاء. If someone had that situation, the caution, of course, because this doesn't happen commonly, is to just pray it again. But in some situations, someone may be barely holding on to deen, like you keep telling them to do what's superior, they'll feel what's better for them is not to do anything. كما فسدت فيما لو لم يعلم إصابته أصلا. Likewise, the prayer is invalid if you don't know if you face the qibla. Why? لأن الفساد ثابت باستصحاب الحال. Because the invalidity would be the assumption by exercising the principle of continuity, استصحاب الحال, which is that you don't know which way the qibla is, therefore what's probable is that you're not facing the qibla. ولم يرتفع بدليل. And this principle of continuity, that you're not facing the qibla and you don't know which way the qibla is, has not been lifted by evidence. لأن المشروط لم يحصل حقيقة ولا حكما. Because the condition, which is facing the qibla actually, facing the direction of the qibla actually, if you know it, or effectively by exercising your judgment, has not happened. لم يحصل حقيقة ولا حكما. Now what about وإذا وقع تحريه إلى جهة فصلى إلى غيرها لا تجزئه لتركه الكعبة حكما في حقه. If your judgment occurred to pray in a particular direction when you didn't know the qibla, and you prayed to another one, this is not valid because you left facing the Kaaba actually and effectively with respect to you. وهي الجهة التي تحرها. Because in this situation, the qibla with respect to you is the direction that you exercise your judgment. Because what you say, what did we say? When certainty is not possible, then you إذا تعذر اليقين يصار إلى الظن. وإذا تعذر اليقين يقام الظن الغالب مقام اليقين. When certainty is not possible, then reasonable surety takes the place of certainty. ولو أصاب. And this is even if one faced the right direction, right? So you don't know which way the qibla says. So you said, okay, I think the qibla is this way. You saw the mihrab, say, I'll pray. But you know what? I'm going to pray this way. Allahu Akbar. This is not valid even if you ended up actually praying in the right direction. According to Abu Hanifa, contrary to خلاف أبي يوسف في ظهور إصابته. Contrary to Abu Yusuf, if you ended up praying in the right direction. هو يجعله كالمتحرك. Because in this case, it's as if you use your judgment. في الأواني, if in with respect to vessels. إذا عدل عن تحريه وظهر طهارة ما توضأ به. If you thought that one particular vessel, where there's multiple vessels, you don't know which one is pure. You think that C is pure, but then you ended up, and that A and B are impure, but you used A anyways. وظهر طهارة ما توضأ به. And in that case, if you deemed, to use A, which you thought was najis, but you used it anyways for whatever reason, but it turned out that A was tahir, صحت صلاته. According to Abu Yusuf, the prayer would be valid. وعلى هذا لو صلى في ثوب وهو يعتقد أنه نجس. And on the basis of this, right? And there's and on this difference, if one prayed in a garment believing it's najis, وأنه محدث, أو أنه محدث, or one prayed believing that one is in a state of ritual purity. أو ع- عدم دخول أو اعتق أنه نجس أو أنه محدث أو أو اعتقد عدم دخول الوقت فظهر بخلافه لا تجزئه. That likewise, if one prayed believing that your garments are najis, or that you are not in wudu, or that the time hasn't entered, and the opposite turned out to be true, it's not valid. وَإِن وُجِدَ الشَّرْط, even if the condition was fulfilled. Why? لِعَدَمِ شَرْطٍ آخر, because you did not fulfill another condition, which is وَهُوَ فَسَادُ فِعْلِهِ ابْتِدَاءً, which is the corruption of their action in the beginning. لِعَدَمِ الْجَزْم, because you weren't decisive that you're entering the prayer, because you believe that one of the conditions is not fulfilled. أما في الماء فقد وجدت الطهارة حقيقة والنية, because with respect to the water, the tahara, which is a tangible state, has been found, and the intention has been found. Okay, this is في غير الموسوس. This is for other than the person of waswasa, because this is if one believes. يعتقد meaning one believes. اعتقاد is الجزم. You are sure that you're najis. صاحب الوسوسة لا ظن له. Right? We keep mentioning this principle, right? صاحب الوسوسة لا ظن له. Has no judgment. Right? So they say, I think I'm najis. Say, can you see any najis? No, you're not najis. Right? This is إنما يعمل بالظاهر. Right? They go with the outward. Right? ولو تحرى قوم جهات في ظلمة وجهلوا حال إمامهم في توجهه تجزئهم. If a number of people arrive at different judgments with respect to the qibla in the dark, and they don't know which way their imam faced in his direction, this will be valid for them. يعني تجزئهم يعني صلاتهم إلا من تقدم على إمامه, except for one who's ahead of the imam, كما في جوف الكعبة, like in the jawf of the Kaaba, like in the inside of the Kaaba, لما قدمناه, because of what we've mentioned before, right? Because of the hadith of Sayyidina Amir, right, that we saw earlier. But of course, if they can take a means, like for example, hold hands and so on, right? Then that would be superior. And then we get to the wajib actions of the prayer. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be of those who take the means to fulfill our responsibilities. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. From the responsibilities of the talib ilm is to understand these issues with precision, and things like the rulings of the Kaaba, of the Qibla, with respect to exercise. What happens if you realized a mistake, or realize that you were facing the Qibla, with judgment, without judgment? Unless you diagram it, write it out, you won't remember it, even if you've memorized the matan, because a lot of the key details are in the sharh. And then we look at the wajib actions of the prayer, which he tells us are 18. وصلى الله على سيد المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Okay.
The first is, did the Imam apply this principle, the ability of another not being considered for all of the masail al-fiqh, or only for ibadat? And then could this be applied for all of its masail?
Well, that's a big thing. So Imam al-Karhi mentions in his usul that never, and it's a logical thing to affirm, that never say something with absoluteness, because there's almost always exceptions, right? But this broadly is a principle of Imam Abu Hanifa. There are points of discussion, like what do we mean by ability? In some places it looks like you're dependent on the ability of another, etc. But those are discussed, which is why in the books of the Qawa'id Fiqhiyya, they'll usually mention mustathniyat al-Qawa'id, right? In the mid-sized works on they mention exceptions, and that's because it doesn't fulfill the criterion. So a person is only able with the ability of another. But what if you can pay the person, right? That's where it comes up, right? What if you can pay the person? What if the person is someone who's expected to obey you? etc. So that's where there are some nuances that come, but it's a general principle. But you cannot give fatwa on principles, right? You give fatwa, the whatever level of fiqh you're at, right? The mujtahid goes back to the primary text based on the principles that they follow. The muqallid transmits and applies legal opinions. Qawa'id help us understand the issues and help us see which issues would apply. So they're navigational tools. They're not, you can't give fatwa just on a qa'idah. Next question.
The remaining question, he said that you told us to look up the ayah of قُلِ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ يَغُضُّوا مِنْ أَبْصَارِهِم. And so the remaining 4 questions are with the verse.
Okay.
So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says وَلَا يُبْدِينَ زِينَتَهُنَّ إِلَّا لِبُعُولَتِهِنَّ لِقَوْلِهِ تَعَالَى أَوْ نِسَائِهِنَّ. When it says nisa in this ayah, does it mean all women or Muslims only?
There's khilaf. Their women would mean the women of their household, or their women being the women of the believers. That's where khilaf comes in within the madahib regarding that.
And if it means all women, would this mean that can Muslim women uncover their aura in front of non-Muslims?
No, so that's a different issue, right? That we take the fiqh of the verse from the works of fiqh, right? So what's awrat al-mar'at al-muslima amam al-kafira, right? In our madhab, what's the basis? That they don't uncover, right? But there is ikhtilaf about that. For ayat al-ahkam, an accessible tafsir, it's not a legally deep tafsir, like he doesn't go into usul al-fiqh but it's beautifully done by one of the very blessed scholars of the 20th century, contemporary ulama, very elderly, Shaykh Muhammad Ali al-Sabuni's work, Rawa'i' al-Bayan min tafsir ayat al-ahkam. It is a beautiful tafsir of the ayat al-ahkam. It's not, it's not going to go into the nuances of the legal reasoning, etc. But it explains out the verses, it shows their eloquence, it tells you how the ulama differed on it, etc. It's a breezy read. There's multiple editions online because it's become a very popular book. The Dar al-Qalam edition, as Dar al-Qalam editions tend to be, is much nicer looking than others. So just dig around to find a good looking edition. Dar al-Qalam tends to be a good publisher. I think there's a Dar al-Qalam edition. Been published for a while too, so you find. So it's useful in that sense. So something like this, you get a sense, what did the madahib say and so on, without getting very technical and complicated. But it's not a substitute for the works of ulum al-Quran, of the tafsir ayat al-ahkam, like Jassas or and so on.
What about vice versa? Can a Muslim woman look at the aura of non-Muslims, for example, the hair?
Of non-Muslims or non-Muslim women?
Of non-Muslim women.
Yeah, so now we're going into dars on ahkam al-awra, and one can look at that in ad-durar al-mubaha fi al-hadr wal-ibaha, right?
Should I skip the remaining question?
Okay, go ahead.
What's the ruling of showing aura to animals?
Now, awra relates to morally responsible one would feel shy, but in general, we know the ruling of covering, right? But if one's considered to be in khalwa, there's a definition for khalwa, right? The definition of khalwa is not lifted by the presence of animals, right? So if someone has a pet gerbil in their bedroom and they want to change clothes, they can. Right? They don't have to cover in front of the gerbil. But the presence of the gerbil does not lift, so it applies to the rulings of khalwa.
when the ayah excludes أبناء بعولتهن, does that mean if a man has kids and he remarried, his wife would not have to wear hijab in front of the man's sons?
No, that's not what it meant. So these are a lot of questions related to the ahkam of awrah. So let's take it in a systematic way. Let's look at the ahkam of awrah from ad-Durr al-Mubaha fi al-Hadr al-Ibaha, for example. They're also mentioned in the Hadith al-Ala'iyya, in the Hadr al-Ibaha section, I believe, gathered together. And that's very useful. It's a thinking person's question, but let's take it from there. Then the verse itself, the thing to do is to see, for example, Ra'i' al-Bayan. I mean, you can find the basic thing also in Safwat al-Tafasir, but you can find it at length but in a clear way, right? Things like Jassas, etc., get very technical very fast. Like Jassas is like you need to have covered usul, etc. Al-Jassas actually wrote his al-Fusul fil usul as the fiqh terminology in order to be able to access his tafsir. But also, al-Jassas is relatively early. It's before the settling down of usuli terminology. So one has to be careful. Sometimes people get confused about what Jassas is saying, because he's not necessarily using the usuli expressions in their later usuli usages, because he's somewhat earlier than the settled down terminology of the Hanafi usulis. Okay?
One more question about the verse is asking, إِلَّا مَا ظَهَرَ مِنْهَا, could one argue that this includes the hair?
No, nobody could argue that. Because what is zina? Right? Zina is مَا يُتَزَوَّنُ بِهِ, is what you adorn yourself with. The hair, you don't adorn yourself with it. It is already there. Right? Right? إِلَّا مَا ظَهَرَ مِنْهَا. That's why, Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Abbas defined it as being, the jewelry that appears, right? Right? And some said that it applies to the kuhul, for example. There are different interpretations. مَا ظَهَرَ مِنْهَا, or that which is permitted to display. So there's إِلَّا مَا ظَهَرَ مِنْهَا has number of possible usages, but مَا ظَهَرَ مِنْهَا, but وَلَا يُبْدِينَ زِينَتَهُنَّ, right, is that which you adorn yourself with. So is the zina, or is مَحَلُّ التَّزَيُّن, right? Or is the place where you adorn yourself, which would be the face, which would be the face and the hands, right? But nobody would say that it encompasses the hair, because that's also covered already by the verses by the command to place the khimar. Because خمر الإناء غطاه is to cover it, right? The covering, right? So that's already addressed. The face is accepted. ما ظهر منها. So the scope of ما ظهر منها we can see we could actually share it. It's a good thing to share. You don't have to share that section necessarily. Just mention it's on such and such pages. And those are useful verses about covering, etc. It's a contemporary issue, and it's not a difficult read. It builds confidence too. You actually do it. Yes.
He said he used that all after these questions, and there's no PDF of Durr al-Mubaha.
Durr al-Mubaha. There is a digital version of the Durr al-Mubaha online. Maybe in Word format. You could ask for a friend who could behave in a friendly manner and share the relevant passages. Okay, I need to stop here.